Hey everyone, my name is Usman and in this tutorial I will cover some tips related to React Hook form. Let's get into it. So firstly we'll talk about reusable controlled components. So right now I have got a form here and I am using two fields. One is a name text field which is right here, and then there is a is retired field which is basically a switch. Now if you are coming from a library like Formic which uses only controlled components and you are porting into React Hook form, what you will need to do is you will need to wrap every component with the controller component and then make use of its controller interface to integrate control components in the form. However, this is spaghetti boilerplate code, and if you have a lot of forms where you will basically have to do this wrapping thing with the controller component again and again, and that becomes cumbersome. So what you can do is you can basically create a controlled folder inside your components folder, and basically you can do something like this. So you will basically wrap whatever your component is. So I'm using input component from Chakra UI. I'll basically wrap it such like I will take the props and I will spread all the props in this component. So this would basically behave like an input component but with an additional name prop and a control prop. So I'll basically use the use controller hook here. I'll pass the control and the name, and then basically I'll spread the field here, and basically I'll be able to just use this controlled input component normally without wrapping it with the controller interface. Also, the use controller hook gets the control from the context if you are wrapping your form with the form provider component, so that is very handy. In that case, you only need to literally pass just the name, and that will shrink down your form code to a very minimal code. So now instead of doing this, you will just take the form here, form, then I will wrap this with the form provider component. So form provider, I will get this, I will take it at the bottom, then spread all the form related stuff here. Then here, instead of the controller thing, I will take the input and I will just pass the name. So I'll say name, and here instead of the input I'll say controlled input. Similarly, I'll just copy the controlled input and here I'll say controlled switch, because I have a similar component for the switch as well, and I will just pass is retired here, and no need for this controller boilerplate code. So now you can see that the code has been reduced to a very minimal size, and this works just fine. I don't need to pass the control, I don't need to wrap it with the controller component. Okay, so the next example is the use of the watch function. So right now I have a component here, watch, and in this component I basically want that whatever the name is, I need to show the name in a batch component here. Now since there are no nested components, and this is just one form in one level, there are no nested components, I can use the watch function, and it would trigger the re-render of the form whenever the name field would change. So I have the form right here. I'll go to the console, and whenever I would change the name, you'll see that the parent re-render gets consoled, which means the parent re-renders. That is fine. However, let's say that I move this logic in a separate component. So right now I've got a separate component name here, and let me just add the name component here instead of this. So now again I'm using the watch function from the use form context, just like I was doing it here, and let me remove the watch function from here. Now let me refresh it. Now whenever I change the name, you can see that the parent re-renders and the child re-renders as well. So this is the child component, the batch component where I'm showing the name, and this is the parent component which is basically containing the whole form. Now this is dumb, I need the name only in the child component. I don't need the name in the parent component at all. So ideally what should happen is only the name component should re-render. So in this case I shouldn't use the watch function, because the watch function triggers the re-render of the entire form, not just the component in which it is being used. So if I want that only this component re-renders, because ideally that should happen, I can use the useWatch hook. So I will get the useWatch and I will pass the name here. Now let me refresh it. Now if I am changing the name, you can see that only the child re-renders in which the name is being subscribed to this component, and the parent is not re-rendering, and that is very good way to optimize your form. Now there's another thing which is segregation of the watch function or the use watch hook. So I've got a separate watch component here. I am using a form provider. I have got two components, so a form display and a form. So form is basically just a form with two controlled inputs, name and description. Then there is a is senior controlled switch and another is retired controlled switch. So 4 fields. And then I have a form display here. So basically I am using the useWatch hook to get all the information and basically displaying stuff right here. So I have a console log here, and I can change the name will show here, then the description would show here. Then if I toggle the is senior to true, then the is senior badge would show here. Similarly, if I toggle is retired to true, then this would become disabled. Now there is one problem. This form display component is basically displaying the name, description, is senior and is retired, and these are basically all the fields of the form. So this is actually literally behaving like formic. So in formic, when any field changes, the entire form or whatever component it is re-renders, right? Same thing is happening here. So we are not using React hook form to its full potential. Now this is not the way to use it because this is behaving literally like formic. So what I can do is I can separate these components into 3 separate components based on their logic or concern. So these 3 are name fields, right, or name text. So what I can do is I can extract this into a separate component, and I can use a useWatch hook there, which would only change when these 2 fields would change. Similarly, for this particular case, I can make another component which would only trigger re-render when is senior would change. So it would only subscribe to is senior. Similarly, I can get this button and I can make this a separate component which would only re-render when is retired would re-render. Or you can couple those into one component as well, your choice, but that would significantly improve the performance of this particular component. Now basically I have done the thing which I was telling about. So I've extracted the name and description stuff into form display text. So this would only re-render when name or description would change. Similarly, when a senior would change, this component would re-render. When the is it retired would change, then this form display button component would re-render. And the form display component would re-render only the first time. So let's test it. So now you can see that all 4 components have re-rendered. That's great. I type something in the name field, only the display text component renders. Similarly, if I type something in the description field, that happens. If I change the is senior switch, then form display senior component re-renders. Same for is retired, its particular component re-renders. But the form display component, which is the parent component, which is displaying all the information regarding the form, that re-renders only once when it mounts. So that is how you should use useWatch. You should segregate useWatch into its own components. You shouldn't just put a useWatch and add like 10 dependencies in it. That is not how it should work. Okay, so now we'll talk about preferring controlled components. So right now I've got a Slack component from Chakra UI. This can behave as both uncontrolled and controlled component. So right now I'm using it in an uncontrolled fashion. I'm using the register function so that it would use ref to set its initial value. So the initial value is Michael. And basically for the options, I have a members array, which is Usman, Alex, and Michael. So you can see that the Michael value has been loaded as the initial value, which is great. Now there is one problem. If I don't get this static array from the constants and I use a query, so basically this query is just returning the members array but with a slight delay. So it is emulating a query, some data coming from the server. So now if I save it and I refresh it, you'll see that I have the options, but it doesn't set the initial value. Why? So basically how the register function sets the value when the component mounts, basically it uses the ref to set its value, like ref.value is equal to something of the sort. So initially, obviously, since options are not present and there is no value, when it does the ref.value is equal to stuff, like the initial value isn't set in this select because the options come after 2 seconds. And the setting of the initial value happens instantaneously. So this doesn't work. So in a lot of cases, bugs like these would come when you will be using the uncontrolled approach, and you will be like, what is happening, what is the issue? And the issue will be regarding the uncontrolled components. So I would say that you should prefer using all controlled components. You shouldn't use uncontrolled components at all, because even if you are using controlled components, like the re-rendering would happen at their scale, like the whole form wouldn't re-render at all. Only those sub fields or sub components will re-render when their field value would change, which is totally okay. React can handle this, even if you're typing like instantaneously fast, because only that field component is changing. So in this case, if I have a controlled input, only this component would be changing, not the form, right? So this is totally okay. So what you should do is you should try to prefer controlled components over this approach. So if I change this into a controlled component, so I have a control select component as well. So I will remove this, I will pass a name, the name is already provided, cool. Let me wrap it with form provider. So this will go here, this will go here. Let me take the form and let me spread the form in the form provider. So now let me refresh the form, and after 2 seconds you'll see that the field value basically is set, which is cool. So when you are using the control approach, bugs like these don't happen, so you should prefer using that. Okay, so now we'll talk about multiple form submissions. So right now I have a form, there is just one text field, and then there are 3 buttons. In a lot of cases there is not just one submission button, there are multiple buttons. Just like in this case, there is a button which would send this information to admin, there is a button which would just save it for later, there is a button which would complete it. So maybe and for these particular 3 separate buttons, there are like 3 separate mutations which you have to call. So a lot of times people are confused as to how to take this, because there is only one submit handler. So how can you know like which button has been clicked? So you don't have to use the on submit logic, when you have multiple buttons. It is not, even if you have one button, like it's not mandatory to do this. You can get the get values function from useForm, and basically get values function is a function which when you call returns the values at that particular instant. So what you can do is you can call the get values function when the button is clicked, get the current form values, and do whatever you want to do with the values, like send a mutation, whatever. You don't need to basically set the type to submit and then do this, because in multiple form submissions case, like this is not a good approach. So you can basically do something like this. So I have gotten the values from the form, from the use form hook, and basically these are 3 separate functions which you can say are 3 mutations, and basically I have called the get values function and passed those values to these mutations. So this is a much better way. You don't have to use the submission flow of the form, the typical way of doing it. Now the last thing I will talk about is reusable utilities. So right now I have got a form and I'm basically using the set value function from the use form hook. So basically, let's say this is a field. I want that when the field changes, then I want to set the name field to undefined. I want to set the description to whatever the value which is selected in the select, and I want to set the email to a test value. So there will be a lot of cases where you will, let's say, use set value again and again to set the values for 3 to 4 values. So this is not a really good way to do it. What you can do is you can make a function which would basically accept an object with keys and values. So the keys will basically go here, the value would go here. You basically want to store that entire object in the set value function like this. So what you can do is you can basically make a hook for it which would return not only the stuff that the use form hook returns, but also some other stuff, just like I mentioned right now. So just like in this case, I made a hook. Basically this is using the use form context hook. Again, it can use the use form hook as well, whatever you want. And it is getting the form, it is returning all the form utils, so all the form related stuff is being returned, that is okay. But I have also made a function which is basically doing exactly what I was telling you about. So it is expecting an object of values, it is iterating over the values, it is taking the key and value, and basically it is calling the set value function again and again for each key value pair. So I don't have to call the set value function again and again. Similarly, you can make any kind of function you want, and you can use this hook instead of the standard use form hook or whatever in every place, and whenever you will need to use that utility, you can use that anywhere you want. And it would be much more scalable if you have a lot of forms in your application. So that is it for the tutorial. I hope you learned a lot regarding React hook form. If you want me to make advanced level tutorial or course or a basic course regarding React hook form, do let me know down in the comments below, because I have worked with React hook form in a much advanced manner. I have made recursive forms with it, etc. So if you want that course or tutorial, do let me know down in the comments below. As always, keep supporting, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will meet you with the next video. Bye.